The voicemail came in at 3:17 in the morning on a Tuesday in October 2019, and I almost deleted it without listening. I almost did. The number was a 312 area code, Chicago, but I didn't recognize it, and my phone had been full of spam calls all week. I was lying in my apartment in Baltimore, one arm thrown over my face, rain hitting the window in sheets, and I had been half asleep for maybe 40 minutes after a 14-hour day at the newsroom. I reached over, saw the notification, and my thumb hovered over the red X. Something stopped me. I still can't tell you what it was. Instinct, maybe. The particular exhaustion of a woman who has spent 12 years chasing stories that don't want to be found. I pressed play. The voice on the other end was male. Older, gravelly in the way of someone who had either smoked for decades or cried recently or both. He spoke slowly, like a man choosing each word the way you'd choose which wire to cut on a bomb. He said, "My name doesn't matter. What matters is that Anthony Caruso did not die in that car fire in 1997. He is alive. He has been alive this whole time. And the people who helped him disappear, some of them are still in office. You want a story? I got a story, but you call me back before Friday, or I'm gone. And I mean gone. You understand me?" Then he hung up. I sat up in bed. I turned on the lamp. I played it again, and then I played it a third time. And by the third time I was already pulling up everything I had ever read or heard or half remembered about Anthony Caruso. Which, honestly, wasn't much. A name from a federal indictment I'd skimmed years earlier, a footnote in a book about the Chicago outfit, a man who was supposedly incinerated in a car on the South Side when I was 17 years old and still thought the news was something that happened to other people. I didn't sleep again that night. My name is Elena Marsh. I am 41 years old. I have been an investigative journalist for the Chicago Tribune, the Baltimore Sun, and for the past 6 years. For an independent nonprofit newsroom called the Harrington Institute that publishes long-form investigations into organized crime, political corruption, and law enforcement misconduct. I have been threatened 4 times in my career. I have had my apartment broken into twice. I have testified before a grand jury. I have also won 2 national press awards, which I keep in a box in my closet because I find them embarrassing, the way trophies for things that almost killed you tend to be. I tell you all of this not to sound important, but because you need to understand who I was before this story, before Anthony Caruso, before what happened in the winter of 2019 and the spring of 2020, before I started understanding just how deep a lie can go when powerful men decide together that it is necessary. You need to understand who I was before I stopped sleeping properly, before I started checking the lock on my door 3 times every night, before I understood, really understood. In my body, not just my head, that some stories don't end when you publish them. Some stories end you. I called back Thursday morning. I know. I waited 2 days. Part of that was professional caution. Part of it was that I spent those 2 days doing preliminary research, trying to establish whether there was anything substantive here or whether I was about to spend an hour on the phone with a paranoid retiree who'd watched too many documentaries. But part of it, and I'll be honest with you, was fear. Not of the caller, of what he might tell me being true. Because if Anthony Caruso was alive, if this wasn't just a crank call, then what I was potentially looking at was a coordinated federal fraud involving the United States Marshals Service, possibly the FBI, certainly the Chicago outfit's remnants, and at least several members of the Illinois state government. That's not a story, that's a grenade. He picked up on the second ring. I said, "This is Elena Marsh. You called me." He said, "I know who you are. I've been reading your work for 3 years. Your piece on the pension fund diversion in Cook County, that's what made me think you were the right one. You're careful, you verify. You don't go off half-cocked." I said, "I try not to." He said, "You're going to want to be recording this." I was already recording. I said, "I am." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My name is Raymond Doyle. I am 67 years old. I was a special agent with the FBI's Chicago field office from 1983 to 2002. I am calling you because I have terminal pancreatic cancer and approximately 4 months to live, and I have decided that I would rather die having told the truth than die having kept a secret that I should never have been asked to keep in the first place. I wrote his name down. I circled it. I underlined it. He said, Anthony Caruso did not die in September of 1997. The car fire was staged. The body in the car was not his. The body in the car was a man named Joseph Falcone, a low-level associate with no surviving family, who died of a heroin overdose 2 days before the staged event and whose death was covered up as part of the arrangement. Caruso was given a new identity through a program that was officially classified as a confidential WITSEC variant but was never actually filed through the standard Justice Department channels. He was moved, given documents, given money, a significant amount of money, and relocated. He has been living under an assumed name in the southwestern United States for the past 22 years. I said, why? He said, because Anthony Caruso knew things that certain people very much did not want testified in open court. And because the men who made that decision calculated that a quiet disappearance was cheaper and cleaner than a trial that would have implicated 3 federal judges, a sitting U.S. senator, and a deputy director of the FBI. The rain had stopped. My apartment was very quiet. I said, do you have documentation? He said, I have a great deal of documentation. Whether you ever get to see it depends entirely on whether you can convince me in the next few weeks that you are serious, that you are careful, and that you understand what you are walking into. I said, tell me what I'm walking into. He said, a room with no exits, Miss Marsh. The only question is whether you go in with your eyes open or your eyes closed. Let me tell you who Anthony Caruso was supposed to be, who the official record says he was, before Raymond Doyle's phone call started me pulling on a thread that would unravel things I still haven't fully processed. Anthony Caruso was born in 1951 in Cicero, Illinois, the second son of a sheet metal worker and a woman who taught 3rd grade at a Catholic elementary school. By the time he was 23, he was running numbers for a crew connected to the outfit, the Chicago outfit, the organization that is sometimes called the Chicago Mob, though the men inside it never use that word. By 30, he was a lieutenant. By 35, according to federal surveillance records that would eventually be declassified, he was considered one of the most capable financial operators in the organization's history. This is important. Anthony Caruso was not primarily a violent man, though violence was certainly part of his world. What Anthony Caruso was a genius with money. Not a formal genius, he never finished college, but the kind of man who understood instinctively how money moves, how it hides, how it transforms itself from something dirty into something clean and unremarkable. The outfit had always had earners. Men who generated cash through gambling and loan sharking and extortion. What they'd had less success with was the second half of the equation, making that cash usable, legitimate, safe from seizure. Anthony Caruso solved that problem. He did it through a network of businesses that I would spend months mapping out in a spreadsheet that eventually covered 3 monitors in my office. Laundromats, car washes, and restaurants on the surface. That's the cliché. That's what everyone knows about money laundering. And it's true, those were part of it. But Caruso went deeper and broader than that. He moved money through commercial real estate transactions where the property was deliberately overappraised and the markup absorbed the dirty cash. He moved it through a private currency exchange on the near northwest side that processed foreign remittances, skimming from the transactions in ways that the IRS's algorithms at the time were not designed to catch. He moved it through a series of shell corporations incorporated in Delaware and Nevada whose ownership structures were so deliberately convoluted that even after years of investigation, federal prosecutors could only untangle the first 2 or 3 layers before hitting a wall. He was, by every account I eventually assembled, extraordinarily good at what he did. And in the outfit, being extraordinarily good at something valuable meant you survived things that killed less useful men. Until 1994. In 1994, a federal grand jury in Chicago began an investigation that prosecutors internally called Operation Clean Ledger. The investigation was focused initially on tax fraud and racketeering, the standard charges that the government used as entry points into organized crime cases. But as the investigation expanded, wiretaps, informants, physical surveillance, subpoenaed bank records, it began to produce something far more troubling than the usual evidence of mob financial crimes. It began producing evidence of complicity, official complicity, not just a corrupt cop here and there, not the routine envelopes slipped under doors, but systematic, organized, deliberate corruption at levels that the Chicago field office of the FBI had apparently not been prepared to find. A federal judge who had dismissed 3 previous racketeering cases against outfit members, dismissed them on procedural grounds that, in retrospect, seemed unusually creative, was on a monthly retainer funneled through a legitimate-seeming consulting firm that Anthony Caruso controlled. A deputy U.S. attorney had received, over a period of years, approximately $340,000 in payments routed through a real estate transaction involving a property he'd nominally sold to an LLC that was 4 corporate layers down, controlled by another Caruso-linked entity. And then there was Senator Thomas Brennan of Illinois, a 3-term incumbent who chaired the Senate Subcommittee on Organized Crime. I want you to sit with that for a moment. The man who chaired the Senate Subcommittee on Organized Crime, who had received campaign contributions from a network of donors who were, the investigation was beginning to show, strawmen for outfit money. This was what Anthony Caruso knew. Not just knew, documented. He had kept records. This is the thing that I kept coming back to as I reconstructed the story. This detail that seemed almost absurd, the man had kept records. Not because he was planning to cooperate, not initially, but because in his world, documentation was insurance. If you had paper on powerful men, those men couldn't easily move against you. It was mutually assured destruction in file form. But by 1996, the investigation had gotten close enough that Caruso understood the insurance had become a liability. The people whose names were in his files were scared, and scared powerful men are the most dangerous kind of animal. There had been 2 attempts on his life that year, both made to look like accidents, both clumsy enough that he'd survived. He knew a 3rd attempt would be more professional. He reached out to the FBI, not through official channels. He wasn't stupid. He reached out to Raymond Doyle directly, through a mutual contact, an old South Side priest who had, over the decades, served as a quiet broker between the Catholic community, law enforcement, and the outfit in the particular Chicago way where those 3 things had always overlapped more than anyone publicly acknowledged. He said he wanted to talk. He said he had information that would be of considerable interest. He said he wanted, in exchange, not just protection but disappearance. Complete, total, permanent. He did not want to testify. He did not want WITSEC in the traditional sense, the new name in a new city with federal handlers who knew where you were and could be pressured. He wanted out, fully out, off the books. Raymond Doyle, according to everything he told me across the 8 conversations we would have over the following 3 months, understood immediately that what Caruso was proposing was illegal. He also understood that what Caruso was offering, the documentation, the names, the proof, was explosive in a way that could either clean out a genuinely catastrophic rot in the federal system or, if handled wrongly, destroy the careers and potentially the lives of everyone involved in the investigation. He made a decision. He would later describe it to me as the worst decision of his life, and the most necessary one, and he seemed to hold both of those things simultaneously without any apparent need to resolve the contradiction. He said, yes, I need to talk about Joseph Falcone, because nobody else ever has. Joseph Falcone was 31 years old when he died of a heroin overdose in a room at the Marquette Hotel on the west side of Chicago on September 4, 1997. He was 5'10", brown hair, brown eyes, approximately the same build as Anthony Caruso, who was 5'9" and 56 years old at the time. They did not look particularly alike. They did not need to, for the purposes of what Doyle and his collaborators had planned, because a body burned in an accelerant-fueled car fire for 45 minutes is not identified visually. It is identified through dental records and, when dental records are insufficient, through the particular configuration of old injuries and surgical hardware that a forensic pathologist looks for in the bones. Anthony Caruso had a titanium plate in his left tibia from a car accident in 1978. He had a root canal on his upper left second molar performed by a dentist in Cicero named Dr. Carlo Mancini in 1989. These facts were in the FBI's file on Caruso, because the FBI had been surveilling him for years and had accumulated an extensive physical profile. Raymond Doyle had access to that file. And so, in the week before the staged accident, Doyle was never specific about who performed this particular act. And I was never able to determine it independently, ensured that Joseph Falcone's remains would present with a titanium plate in the left tibia and a specific dental configuration. The details of how this was accomplished are things I will not describe, because some of what I know I have chosen not to put into print for reasons I'll explain later, and this is one of them. Joseph Falcone had been a petty criminal, 2 priors for possession, 1 for receiving stolen goods. He had a sister in Indiana whom he was estranged from. No wife, no children. He had been, in the language of the men who made this decision, someone whose absence would not generate significant inquiry. I find myself unable to write that sentence without stopping and acknowledging what it means about the value placed on his life by the men who used his body. I think about his sister in Indiana. I think about whether she ever had a grave to visit, or whether her brother simply ceased to exist one day with no explanation. She would have been told he died of an overdose. If she was told anything at all, she would not have been told the rest. The car fire occurred on the night of September 12, 1997, on a street in the Bridgeport neighborhood. The vehicle, a 1994 Lincoln Town car registered to a company connected to the outfit, was found burning at 11:43 p.m. The fire department responded. The remains inside were recovered. The Cook County Medical Examiner's Office conducted an examination and, based on dental records and the titanium plate, identified the remains as those of Anthony Caruso. The death was classified as a homicide, unsolved, attributed to an internal outfit conflict. Nobody was ever charged. The Chicago Tribune ran a brief story on page 14. The Sun-Times ran a longer one on page 3. Both noted that Caruso had been under federal investigation. Both quoted anonymous law enforcement sources describing his death as possibly related to ongoing tensions within organized crime circles. The FBI declined comment. The investigation, called Operation Clean Ledger, was formally closed 6 months later. Attributed in internal documents to the death of the primary target and the destruction of key evidence in the car fire. And Anthony Caruso, the real Anthony Caruso, in a body that was not on fire and not dead, was driven by Raymond Doyle personally to a private airfield outside Joliet, Illinois, put on a small plane, and flown to Tucson, Arizona, where a new life was waiting for him, assembled from the particular institutional knowledge that a federal agent accumulates over 19 years. How documents are created, how histories are built, how a man becomes someone else if the right people decide it should be so. His new name was Robert Edward Harlan. He was, on paper, a recently retired contractor from Phoenix who had relocated to the Tucson suburbs for health reasons. He had a social security number, a driver's license, a modest but real bank account. He had a small house in a development called Desert Sunrise Estates in the Catalina foothills that had been purchased at slightly below market value, through a transaction I would eventually trace back to a real estate holding company with no obvious connection to anything, until I looked at the incorporation documents, filed in Nevada in 1996, and found a registered agent whose name I will get to in due course. He was 46 years old. He had, according to Raymond Doyle, approximately $600,000 in cash that had been moved in ways I will not detail. He had a new face in the sense that people who have only ever seen surveillance photos would not recognize him. He had lost weight significantly during the stress of the preceding years, grown a beard, and within the first year dyed his hair gray, which aged him a decade. He had, Doyle told me, strict instructions, no contact with anyone from his previous life. No trips to Chicago, ever. No financial transactions that could be traced. No public profile of any kind. He had also, according to Doyle, been given something else. He had been given a name. A single name. A contact. Someone he could reach in an emergency. Someone who would know how to help him if the arrangement ever came apart. Someone who was still inside the system. Doyle would not tell me that name during our initial conversations. He told me it existed. He said that when the time was right, he would tell me. And then, before the time was right, something happened that complicated everything. Raymond Doyle was diagnosed with his cancer in June of 2019. He was given 6 months. He made my phone call in October, and he told me, in our third conversation, that the emergency contact he had given Anthony Caruso, Robert Harlan, in 1997 had used that contact number as recently as 18 months earlier. In April of 2018, Caruso had called the number. I asked why. Doyle said, because someone had found him. I want to tell you about my research process, because it's important and because it's where this story starts becoming something more than one old man's deathbed confession. After my third conversation with Doyle, I did what journalists do. I started building a file. I hired a researcher named Marcus Webb, a former forensic accountant who now works freelance for newsrooms and law firms and who has a particular skill for finding things in corporate records that are supposed to be invisible. I told him we were looking at a money laundering network with potential tendrils into real estate transactions in Arizona and Nevada going back to the mid-90s. I did not tell him about Caruso or Doyle. I was careful about that. When you have a source whose safety depends on compartmentalization, you compartmentalize. I also began reviewing everything I could find in the public record about Operation Clean Ledger. The investigation had been closed, but federal investigations leave traces, court filings, grand jury subpoenas that eventually become declassified, congressional testimony, journalistic accounts from the time. I spent 3 weeks in the morgue of the Tribune's archives, reading every story about the outfit and about Caruso from 1994 through 1998. I found something in the archives that I hadn't expected. There were, in the coverage from 1996 and 1997, several references to a federal grand jury witness who was described only as a cooperating individual with knowledge of outfit financial operations. The references were oblique, careful. Reporters at the time were being responsible about protecting the identity of someone who was presumably in a dangerous position. But in one story, published in the Tribune on March 14, 1997, 6 months before the staged car fire, there was a detail that caught my eye. The story described this cooperating individual as having provided documentation related to financial relationships between organized crime figures and elected officials at the state and federal level. It then noted, in a parenthetical almost buried in the middle of a long paragraph, sources close to the investigation say the cooperating individual's information has been shared with a restricted group within the Justice Department due to concerns about potential exposure within the investigative chain. Potential exposure within the investigative chain. That's a careful way of saying they were worried about leaks. That they were worried someone inside was dirty. That the information Caruso had provided was so sensitive that they didn't trust their own normal processes. I made a note of the reporter's byline, a woman named Patricia Okafor, who had covered federal courts for the Tribune from 1991 to 2003 and who, I learned from LinkedIn in a brief Google search, was now 62 years old and living in retirement in Evanston, Illinois. I sent her a letter, actual paper, in an envelope, introducing myself, explaining that I was working on a long-form piece related to the Clean Ledger investigation, and asking if she would be willing to speak with me. She called me the day she received the letter. She said, "I've been waiting for someone to ask me about this for a long time." Patricia Okafor met me at a coffee shop in Evanston on a Tuesday morning in November 2019. She was a tall woman with close-cropped gray hair and the particular composure of someone who has spent decades watching terrible things and learning not to react visibly. She ordered an Americano. She waited until the server had moved away from our table before she said anything substantive. She said, "I need to ask you something before we talk. Not as a condition of talking. Just because I want to know. Do you understand what you're doing?" I said, "I'm beginning to." She said, "No, you're not. Not yet. But go ahead." What Patricia Okafor told me that morning, and across 3 subsequent conversations that I recorded with her consent, confirmed and extended the framework that Doyle had given me, but it also added something Doyle hadn't mentioned, or hadn't known, or had chosen not to tell me yet. It added a person. In early 1997, while the grand jury investigation was still active and before the decision to fake Caruso's death had been fully implemented, Okafor had been tipped by a source inside the U.S. Attorney's Office that there was a witness in protective custody who was providing extraordinary information. The tip was informal. A conversation at a bar near the federal courthouse, a colleague's oblique mention of something big building. Okafor had started pulling threads, the way reporters do. She'd identified, through careful work I won't detail because it would identify her source, that the cooperating individual was connected to Caruso. And then, in early summer of 1997, she had been approached by a woman. The woman had come to her at the Tribune, unannounced, on a Wednesday afternoon. She had been wearing a blue wool coat despite it being warm. She was in her mid-30s, dark hair, dark eyes, well dressed in the understated way of someone with money who had chosen not to advertise it. She had sat down across from Okafor in the newsroom, looked at her steadily, and said, "I know you're looking into Anthony Caruso. I want you to stop." Okafor had looked at her for a long moment and said, "And you are?" The woman had said, "My name is Angela Caruso. He's my father, and what you're doing is going to get him killed." Angela Caruso was 29 years old in 1997. She was Anthony Caruso's daughter from his first marriage, a marriage that had ended when she was 4 years old. She had been raised by her mother in Oak Park, deliberately kept at a distance from the world her father inhabited, and by most official accounts had had minimal contact with him throughout her adult life. The FBI file on Anthony Caruso listed her name, noted her employment as a paralegal at a downtown Chicago law firm, and flagged her as a potential but unlikely avenue of contact for surveillance purposes. She had never been charged with anything. She had never, to anyone's official knowledge, been involved in her father's operations. She had also, Okafor told me, clearly known exactly what her father was and what was happening to him. Not the specific details of the federal arrangement. She couldn't have known those, not yet. But she knew he was in danger. She knew the investigation was closing in. And she was scared in the specific, controlled way of someone who has been frightened for a long time and has learned to wear the fear like a coat you don't take off. Okafor had told her that she couldn't simply stop a journalistic investigation because a subject's daughter asked her to. Angela Caruso had nodded as if she'd expected this. She'd stood up, buttoned her blue coat, and said, "When this is over, and when it's safe, I'll tell you everything I know. That's all I can offer you." And then she'd walked out of the newsroom and disappeared. Okafor had continued her reporting. And then the car fire had happened. And then the story had been about a dead mob financier on page 14. And then Operation Clean Ledger had been closed. And Angela Caruso had never come back. I asked Okafor, "Did you try to find her?" After? She said, "Of course. Her apartment was vacated. Her employer said she'd resigned without notice in August of 1997, a month before the fire. Her mother said she hadn't heard from her in months." She paused. She looked out the window at the Evanston Street. "I assumed she'd gone with him. Wherever he went. I assumed they'd built a life somewhere and that I would never hear from either of them again." I said, "And?" Okafor turned back and looked at me. "6 years ago," she said slowly, "I got a postcard. No return address. The picture on the front was a generic desert landscape. No text except, 'He's still alive. So am I, so is the danger. Don't forget.' No signature. I've kept it in a drawer in my desk ever since." She reached into her bag and slid it across the table to me. It was in a plastic evidence sleeve, the kind reporters use when they've been doing this long enough. The postmark was from Tucson, Arizona. The date was November 2013. I photographed it with my phone. I sat with what it meant. Angela Caruso, in 2013, was 45 years old. She was still out there. She was still watching, and she had been scared enough, 6 years before my story began, to reach out to the one reporter who had tried to find her father and warn her without saying a word that could be used as evidence, that whatever the arrangement was, it was not safely buried. I drove back to Baltimore that night. I didn't turn on the radio. I needed the quiet to think. By the time I reached the Susquehanna Bridge on 95, I had a list of questions, and one of them was sitting higher than all the others. If Angela Caruso had sent a warning to Patricia Okafor in 2013, and if Anthony Caruso had activated his emergency contact in April of 2018, and if Raymond Doyle, dying of cancer, 4 months to live, had called me in October of 2019, then what had happened in those years that was making the net pull tighter? What had someone found? I didn't know yet, but I was going to. Marcus Webb came back to me in December with 3 things. The first was a corporate map, beginning with the real estate holding company that had purchased Caruso's house in Tucson in 1996, the one whose Nevada incorporation documents I'd first flagged. Marcus had traced a network of shell corporations backward and sideways through 23 years of property records, business registrations, and financial filings. The network was a masterpiece of obfuscation, the kind of work that Anthony Caruso had been doing for the Chicago outfit for 2 decades and that he had apparently continued. In modified form, in his new life, there were 12 discrete entities at various levels. Some had been dissolved, some were still active. At the center of the surviving active entities, like a hub in a wheel, was a limited liability company registered in New Mexico in 2009 called Harlan Property Management LLC. The registered agent for Harlan Property Management LLC was a man named Gregory Solis. Gregory Solis was 61 years old. He was a licensed accountant based in Albuquerque, New Mexico, with a practice that primarily served small businesses and real estate investors. He had no criminal record. He had no obvious connection to the Chicago outfit, to Anthony Caruso, or to anything else that should have concerned a federal investigator. He was, on every available surface, exactly what he appeared to be, a competent, unremarkable accountant. But Marcus, who has been doing this work for 20 years and has developed a particular sensitivity to certain patterns, had noticed something. Solis's client roster, insofar as it could be reconstructed from business registration documents and county property records, showed a striking number of real estate transactions in a particular price range, between $400,000 and $1.2 million, in southern Arizona and New Mexico, concentrated in the years between 2005 and 2015. The transactions showed consistent patterns: properties acquired slightly below market value, held for 2 to 4 years, sold at modest profit. Nothing that would attract individual attention. Everything consistent with a small real estate investment practice. But the aggregate volume was unusual for a solo practitioner. And when Marcus looked at who the buyers were in several of these transactions, he found LLCs, always LLCs, never individuals, with minimal paper trails and addresses that traced back to UPS stores and registered agent services. It was not proof of money laundering. It was the shape of money laundering, the silhouette of it. The second thing Marcus gave me was a name that appeared in 3 separate property transactions connected to the Solis network, always as a signatory on behalf of one of the LLCs. The name was Edward R. Harlan, not Robert Edward Harlan, Caruso's official alias. Edward R. Harlan, a small transposition, the kind of thing that looks like a simple variation of a common name but that I recognized immediately, when I saw it alongside the Tucson address patterns, as Caruso making a lazy mistake. Or not a mistake, possibly a deliberate thread left in case someone needed to follow it. A breadcrumb from a man who had never fully trusted the people who'd built his new life for him and had wanted some way to be findable by someone he chose. The third thing was harder to process. Marcus had, in the course of his research, run a standard background search on Gregory Solis. Clean record, as I'd said. But in the course of that search, through a legal data aggregator service, Marcus had found a civil court filing from Pima County, Arizona. Tucson is in Pima County, from 2018. It was a small claims matter, quickly resolved, involving a billing dispute between Solis and a property management company. Routine, but in the defendant's response filing, Solis's attorney had included, as an exhibit, a copy of a business agreement between Solis and a client. The document had been redacted, as attorneys often do before filing, but the redaction was imperfect, a black box over a name that was slightly smaller than the text beneath. So that in certain viewing angles, when Marcus had photographed the physical filing at the county courthouse, you could read through the box. The name under the box was Robert E. Harlan. It was April of 2018 that this filing was made, the same month that Doyle had told me Caruso had activated his emergency contact. I sat in my office for a long time after Marcus gave me this. The civil filing had been made public. Anyone who knew to look for it and knew how to look could have found it. Which meant that in April of 2018, somewhere, someone had. And Caruso had known it, or feared it, or been told. He'd called his emergency contact for the first time in 21 years. And 2 years later, Raymond Doyle, the man who'd built the emergency contact system, the man who'd created the whole arrangement, was dying of cancer and calling journalists in the middle of the night. I needed to know who had found that filing in 2018. I needed to know what they had done with what they'd found. I started with the obvious question, who had reason, in 2018, to be looking for Anthony Caruso? There were 3 possible categories. Federal law enforcement, if someone had reopened interest in the Clean Ledger matter. Journalists, if someone had been working a parallel story. Or someone from the outfit. I spent 2 weeks making calls that went nowhere. I called a former federal prosecutor in Chicago who I'd worked with on a previous story. She said she knew nothing about any renewed interest in Caruso and seemed to mean it. I called 2 other veteran crime reporters who'd covered the outfit, both drew blanks. And then I called a source I had cultivated years earlier during my Cook County Pension Fund investigation, a man who works in City Hall, who has survived 4 mayoral administrations by being extremely useful and extremely discreet, and who occasionally, in exchange for considerations I won't detail, points me in productive directions. He said, without being asked directly, "You're not the first person who's been asking about Caruso lately." I said, "Who else is asking?" He said, "There's a lawyer. Young guy, maybe 35. He's been making inquiries, discreet ones. He reached out to a couple of the old-timers who were around during the 90s. Told them he was doing estate work for a client whose father had had business dealings with Caruso. Looking for financial records." I said, "That sounds like a pretext." He said, "It absolutely is a pretext. Nobody does estate work for mob-connected families by cold-calling retired outfit associates." A pause. "His name is Daniel Ferraro. He has an office on LaSalle Street. He's legit, on paper, incorporated, bar member, regular practice. But he showed up from nowhere about 4 years ago. Before that, no history. Which is interesting, for a man who presents as 35. A lawyer who appeared from nowhere 4 years ago, in 2015, presenting a background that didn't bear scrutiny. In my world, that description has one primary meaning. I didn't say it out loud to my source. I thanked him and hung up. Daniel Ferraro. I typed the name into every database I had access to. Illinois Bar Association, admitted 2014, licensed in good standing, practice address on LaSalle Street. No disciplinary history. The bar application listed a law degree from DePaul, class of 2013. I called DePaul's alumni office and was told, after a brief search, that they had no record of a Daniel Ferraro in the class of 2013 or any other year. I called back and confirmed, no record. He had a law license backed by a fraudulent credential, which, I was beginning to understand, might mean that Daniel Ferraro was the latest iteration of a name given to a man who had been someone else before. Just as Robert Edward Harlan had once been Anthony Caruso. Just as Joseph Falcone had become, in death, a tool. Just as this whole story was built on the foundational architecture of men becoming other men when it suited powerful people for them to do so. I needed to find Daniel Ferraro. And I needed to do it carefully, because if I was right about what he was, then he was dangerous in ways that a regular crooked lawyer is not. I drove to Chicago in January of 2020. I told my editor, a man named Howard Reese who has been doing this job for 30 years and who has a finely calibrated sensor for when his reporters are in over their heads, that I was working on a financial corruption story with Chicago roots. I told him it was going well. I didn't tell him about Doyle or about Robert Harlan or about Angela Caruso's postcard. I wasn't ready. I needed more before I was ready to bring it to him. Because what I had at that point was an extraordinary story with an extraordinary evidentiary gap. I had never spoken to or even confirmed the existence of the central figure. I had a dead man's account, a retired reporter's memory, a collection of shell corporations, and a postcard. I needed Anthony Caruso, or I needed someone who could prove he was alive. I stayed in a hotel on Michigan Avenue that I'd used before, nothing fancy, the kind of place where journalists and insurance adjusters stay and nobody pays attention to you. I had a rental car and a legal pad and a plan that I acknowledged to myself was more improvised than was ideal. I found the LaSalle Street office easily enough. Daniel Ferraro, attorney at law, 4th floor of a building that housed 20 other small practices and made no particular impression. I sat in a coffee shop across the street with a direct sightline to the building entrance for 2 days, from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening, reading and waiting and feeling the particular combination of boredom and alertness that surveillance work produces. I saw him on the second day, at approximately 11:15 in the morning. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with dark hair worn short and the particular kind of ordinary handsomeness that doesn't stick in the memory. He was wearing a good coat, not flashy. He walked quickly, head slightly down, the gait of a man who doesn't want to be looked at. He carried a messenger bag. He was on his phone, not talking, just looking at it, scrolling. I photographed him with a long lens from my position at the coffee shop window. Later, when I was back in my hotel room with my laptop, I ran the photograph through every facial recognition resource I had access to. Legitimate ones, journalism databases, publicly licensed photo archives, and got nothing definitive. He was not in any database I could access as Daniel Ferraro. He was not, as a face, in any database that returned any match at all with high confidence. His face was genuinely clean. Either he had managed his digital presence with extraordinary discipline, or he was young enough that his pre-identity documentation simply didn't exist in any digitized archive. The latter would suggest he'd been given his identity quite young, possibly as a teenager or young adult, which would mean, if I was developing the right theory, that his original identity had been established perhaps in the late 90s or early 2000s, and that someone had been planning this particular piece of the operation long before I could account for. I followed him for 3 days. I want to be honest about the legal and ethical complexity of that decision. Following a person without their knowledge raises questions that I wrestle with as a journalist and don't resolve cleanly. My justification, then and now, was that I had reason to believe this individual was not who he presented himself as, that he had a fraudulent law license, and that he was actively engaged in researching a story that touched on federal crimes and potentially endangered a person's life. I make no broader argument. I followed him, and I kept detailed notes. On the first day, he met with 2 people. The first meeting was at a restaurant in the West Loop, lunch, with a man I identified through a subsequent search as a former Cook County Assistant State's Attorney named Michael Conti, who had been involved peripherally in several outfit-related cases in the early 2000s before leaving the prosecutor's office in 2004 to go into private practice. The lunch lasted 90 minutes. I could not hear their conversation. On the second day, Ferraro drove to a neighborhood in Bridgeport, Anthony Caruso's old neighborhood, the neighborhood where the staged car fire had occurred, and sat in a parked car on a residential street for 40 minutes before driving away without getting out. On the third day, he took a flight. I know he took a flight because I was in the airport and I watched him go through security, and I saw the departure board, and his gate was assigned to a flight to Tucson, Arizona. I booked a seat on a later flight to Tucson that evening. I called my editor Howard from the boarding gate. He asked how the story was going. I said it was developing. He said, with the slight tension in his voice that I've learned over the years to translate as I know you're not telling me everything and I'm choosing to wait. Make sure you check in. I said I would. I did not check in regularly enough over the next 3 weeks, and that is something I still think about. Tucson in January is not what people expect if they've only ever experienced Arizona in the summer. The air is cool, the light is clear and pale, the saguaro cacti on the hillsides stand in silhouette against a sky so blue it seems painted. It's beautiful in a way that feels slightly surreal, slightly threatening, the way beautiful things do when you're scared. I rented a car and drove to the Catalina foothills. I found Desert Sunrise Estates on a GPS with no difficulty. It was a quiet development of single-story stucco houses, well-maintained yards, older residents visible through windows or walking small dogs on streets named after desert plants. Serene, deliberately unremarkable, the kind of neighborhood where a man who needed to be invisible would find it easy to be so. I had an address for a property connected to Harlan Property Management LLC. Whether the man named Robert Harlan actually lived at that address was a question I hadn't been able to confirm. I drove past it once. Small house, tan stucco, a cord of red flowering plants along the front walk, a truck in the driveway, newer model, silver, Arizona plates. A motion sensor light above the garage that clicked on as I drove slowly past and that made me feel observed in a way that was probably irrational but that I felt in my sternum. I did not stop. I drove to a motel 3 miles away, checked in, sat on the edge of the bed, and made a list of what I knew and what I needed. What I knew, Raymond Doyle, dying FBI agent, had provided a detailed first-hand account of a staged death, a false identification, and an illegal relocation of Anthony Caruso in 1997. Patricia Okafor had provided corroborating context and the postcard. Marcus Webb had traced a shell corporation network connected to the alias Robert Edward Harlan to a property in this zip code. A man using a fraudulent legal identity had been researching Caruso in Chicago and had flown to Tucson. What I needed, confirmation that the man at that address was Anthony Caruso, and an understanding of who Daniel Ferraro was and what he wanted. I got the first piece 2 days later, by accident, in the produce section of a Safeway 3 miles from Desert Sunrise Estates. I was buying coffee and not sleeping well and not eating properly, and I had gone to the grocery store at 7 in the morning in the particular fog of an investigation that's consuming everything. I was in the produce section when I saw a man examining avocados with the concentrated, slightly irritable expression of someone who has been told to bring home the right avocados and is not confident in his ability to do so. He was in his late 60s, heavy-set but not fat, gray-haired, with a short gray beard and the weathered complexion of someone who has spent years in the sun. He was wearing a fleece vest and jeans. He looked like a retired contractor who had relocated to the Tucson suburbs for health reasons. He looked like what his documents said he was. He also, when he turned to put the avocados in his basket and I caught a full view of his face, looked unmistakably, in the eyes, in the particular set of the mouth, in a structural quality of the face that aging and weight changes and a beard cannot fully disguise, like the surveillance photographs of Anthony Caruso that I had been staring at for 3 months. I kept my face neutral. I had been expecting this and not expecting it. You can prepare yourself conceptually for the moment of confirmation and still have your heart rate spike when it arrives. He did not look at me. He moved on to the citrus. I put my coffee in my basket and went to a different aisle and stood there for 30 seconds doing breathing exercises that I had learned from a therapist I'd seen after my apartment was broken into the second time. Then I followed him at a distance through the rest of the store, maintaining enough space and misdirection that I was confident I was not registering to him as a surveillance presence. He paid with a debit card. Robert E. Harlan, I could see the card from where I stood. He loaded his bags into the silver truck. He drove south toward Desert Sunrise Estates. I sat in the Safeway parking lot for 15 minutes. Then I called Raymond Doyle. I said, "I've seen him. He's here." Doyle was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How does he look?" I said, "Old, tired, ordinary." Doyle said, 22 years of ordinary will do that." Then he said, "Elena, I need to tell you something I should have told you earlier. About Daniel Ferraro." I said, "Tell me." He said, "Ferraro's real name is Anthony Michael Caruso Jr. He is the son of Anthony Caruso, not Angela's brother. They have different mothers. A younger son, from a woman Caruso was involved with in the 80s, who never married him. He would have been born in 1984. He grew up not knowing who his father was. He was told his father was dead. His mother told him, and then, approximately 5 years ago, something changed. I don't know what exactly, but he found out the truth, or part of it, and he built a new identity, not through our channels, through someone else's channels, probably criminal, and he went looking for his father." I said, "Does Caruso know his son is alive? Does the son know his father is here in Tucson?" Doyle said, "As of 6 months ago, no. As of now, I don't know." I said, "Raymond, what does the son want?" A very long pause. "That," Doyle said, "is what I'm afraid of. I need to go back now and fill in something I'd been given pieces of but hadn't yet fully assembled. Something about the original arrangement that Raymond Doyle had entered into with Anthony Caruso in 1997. Something that wasn't in the FBI's files because it was never supposed to exist. When I say that Doyle and his collaborators had given Caruso a new life in exchange for his information and his silence, I'm describing the top layer. The public architecture of the deal, insofar as it had an architecture. But underneath that, there was something else. A second transaction, one that Doyle, in our 6th conversation, finally admitted to me, and that I believe he had been working up to telling me across all the previous conversations, the way a person with a genuinely heavy conscience circles toward the worst thing rather than approaching it directly. In 1996, while the arrangement was being negotiated, Anthony Caruso had provided Doyle with documentation. Extensive documentation. The records of the corruption I've described. The judge. The deputy U.S. attorney, Senator Thomas Brennan. The records were, according to Doyle, exactly as devastating as advertised. Concrete, detailed, corroborated by financial records that could be independently verified. Doyle had received this documentation. He had reviewed it. He had brought it, in abbreviated and summarized form, to 2 people within the FBI hierarchy whom he trusted, and who were, he believed, among the clean ones. The response he'd received from one of these individuals was cautious and procedural. This needed to go up the chain, needed to be assessed, needed to be carefully managed given the sensitivities. The standard institutional response. The response from the other individual was different. The response from the other individual was, "This cannot be prosecuted." This individual, a senior official within the FBI's Organized Crime Division, a man Doyle had known and trusted for 15 years, had explained, carefully and in private, that the documentation Caruso had provided implicated individuals whose exposure would trigger a cascade of consequences that extended well beyond the individuals themselves. Senator Brennan's exposure, this official argued, would potentially compromise 3 ongoing organized crime investigations in which Brennan had been briefed as a subcommittee chair, investigations that had taken years to build and that involved targets far more significant than Caruso or his outfit connections. The judge's exposure would retrospectively invalidate dozens of cases, potentially freeing individuals who were genuinely dangerous. The prosecutorial exposure would trigger a crisis of confidence in the federal court system in the Northern District of Illinois from which, this official argued with apparent sincerity, the institution might not recover. And so this official had made a proposal, not to prosecute, not to destroy the documentation, but to, in the careful language he'd used, which Doyle quoted to me from memory with the particular precision of a man who has replayed a conversation thousands of times, manage the situation in a way that served the larger interests of the institution. Doyle had agreed. He had agreed because he was tired and because the argument had a surface logic and because he told me with a frankness that I found both admirable and terrible. He had been in the FBI for 15 years and had absorbed, without fully realizing it, the institutional assumption that the FBI's integrity was more important than the accountability of any individual, including its own members. The documentation was not destroyed. This is important. Doyle had insisted on this as a condition. He did not trust the system enough to hand the files over entirely. The documentation was, instead, copied. Doyle kept one copy, the official kept one copy, and the originals remained with Caruso as part of the informal understanding that his continued silence was contingent on the arrangement holding. His documentation was his continuing insurance, even in disappearance. As long as he had it and as long as people knew he had it, he was safer than he would have been without it. But Doyle's copy, the copy he had kept in a storage unit in suburban Chicago for 22 years, was not what it had been in 1997, because Doyle, in addition to the original documents, had kept something else, his own meticulous records of the conversations and decisions that had led to the cover-up. His notes, his contemporaneous logs. He had kept them in the same storage unit, in an adjacent container, and had told no one they existed. In our 7th conversation, Doyle told me that he wanted to give me access to the storage unit. He told me the address and the unit number and the combination of the lock. He told me that the records inside were comprehensive and that they contained not only the documentation of Caruso's original corruption files but Doyle's own records of who within the FBI had known, who had decided to suppress, and what had been said in what rooms. He also told me that the senior official who had argued for suppression, the man Doyle had trusted, the man who had made the institutional argument, was not retired. He had risen, over the subsequent 2 decades, to a position that I will not specify here precisely because to do so would effectively identify him given the small number of people who have held that position. But he was, in 2019, a senior official in the United States Department of Justice. And he knew, Doyle believed, that Doyle was dying. And he knew, Doyle believed, that a dying man with a guilty conscience was a source of very specific risks. Doyle told me, I think he's watching. I think he has been for some time. I think the reason I'm telling you this now, and not writing a memoir and sending it to my lawyer, is that I don't trust any institutional channel. I'm calling a journalist because you are the only instrument I can think of that doesn't go through a door this man might be standing behind. I went to the storage unit. I drove to a suburb of Chicago called Addison on a gray Thursday in late January. I found the unit. I opened the lock with Doyle's combination. I spent 4 hours inside with a digital camera and a portable battery-powered light, photographing every document in a systematic grid pattern, working through files that had accumulated 2 decades of stillness, that smelled of old paper and climate-controlled air. I photographed 847 pages. I numbered them as I went. I drove back to my hotel. I uploaded the photographs to 2 separate encrypted cloud services with different passwords and downloaded a 3rd copy to an external drive that I put in a padded envelope and mailed to my sister in Portland, Oregon, with a note that said, "Keep this safe. Don't open it. I'll explain later." I didn't tell my editor. I know that was wrong. I'm still not sure what the right choice was. I was in Tucson when I got the call telling me Raymond Doyle was dead. His daughter called me. I'd given her my number in case of emergency, which I'd told myself was a professional precaution and which I understood, when she called, was also a form of hoping for more time. He died on a Wednesday night in February, which was approximately on the timeline his doctors had given him but still felt sudden in the way all deaths feel sudden. His daughter said he had been lucid until the last days. He had not been in significant pain. She said he had seemed, in his final week, to be at peace in a way that she found hard to account for given that he had been very restless for the months preceding. I sat in my Tucson motel room and thought about what that meant. Whether confessing to a journalist, whether setting the machinery of truth in motion even imperfectly, had given him something. I wanted to believe it had. I'm still not sure whether that belief is evidence of something real or of my own professional need to find meaning in information. I had been in Tucson for 3 weeks. I had confirmed, to my own satisfaction, that the man at Desert Sunrise Estates was Anthony Caruso. I had not yet approached him. I was building toward it, or more accurately, I was deciding whether to build toward it, weighing the journalistic value of a direct confirmation against the risk to him that my approaching him represented, the risk to me that my approaching him represented, and the more abstract but very real ethical question of what my obligation was to a man who had committed serious crimes, participated in the cover-up of corruption, and also been kept alive by a system that had used his information without facing any consequence. I had not yet definitively identified what Daniel Ferraro, Anthony Caruso Jr., was doing in Tucson. I'd lost him the day after I arrived. He'd checked into a hotel and then checked out the next morning, and I hadn't been able to reacquire him. I didn't know if he was still in the city. It was a Tuesday night. I was sitting on the edge of my motel bed eating a sandwich from a gas station and looking at my photographs of Doyle's documents on my laptop. My phone rang. The number was a Tucson area code that I didn't recognize. I answered. A woman's voice. Clear, careful, controlled. She said, "My name is Angela Caruso. I know who you are. I know what you're doing here. I need you to meet me tomorrow morning. Alone, please." I said, "How did you find me?" She said, "My father saw you in the grocery store. He recognized the way you were watching him. He told me." And then I looked up journalists who cover organized crime, and I found your name, and I remembered Okafor mentioning your name to me once, years ago. It wasn't difficult. I said, "Is he afraid?" She said, "He's been afraid for 22 years. But what he is right now is something different. There's someone else here who found him, Miss Marsh. Someone we didn't expect, and we don't know what he wants. And I think you might be the only person who knows what's actually happening. So yes, I'm asking you to meet me." I said, "Where and when?" She said, "There's a diner on Oracle Road. 6:30 in the morning. Sit at the counter. I'll find you." She hung up. I put down my phone. I finished my sandwich. I turned off my laptop. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling of a motel room in Tucson, Arizona, and thought about Raymond Doyle, who was 3 days dead. I thought about Joseph Falcone, who was 22 years dead and had never been properly buried under his own name. I thought about Patricia Okafor's postcard in its evidence sleeve. I thought about 847 pages of documents in an encrypted cloud service. I thought about a senior official in the Department of Justice who knew that the man who had been keeping his secret was gone. I thought, whatever happens tomorrow at that diner, the story is already too far advanced to stop. Which means the only question is what shape it takes when it comes out. And who gets hurt when it does. I set my alarm for 5:30. I didn't sleep. She was already there when I arrived. She was sitting at the far end of the counter, a coffee in front of her, wearing a dark jacket and looking at her phone with the outward composure of someone who has had a long time to practice sitting still in public while being terrified. She was 51 years old. She looked younger than that in the face and older in the eyes, which is a thing that happens to people who have been carrying something heavy for a long time. I sat down next to her. The diner was quiet. 2 other people at the counter, a couple in a booth, a server who brought me coffee without being asked. We sat for a moment and let the ambient noise of the place settle around us. She said, quietly, not looking at me, "He knows you're a journalist. He won't talk to you." I said, "I'm not asking him to. I'm talking to you." She looked at me then. "Evaluating. I've had a lot of people evaluate me over the years. Sources deciding whether to trust me, subjects deciding whether to fear me, and I've learned to sit with the evaluation without flinching." I let her look. She said, "What do you know?" I told her, not everything. I didn't tell her about the storage unit or the documents, not yet. But I told her about Doyle, about Okafor, about the corporate trail. I told her enough that she understood I was not speculating. I was telling her confirmed facts. Her face, while I spoke, was extraordinarily still. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Raymond Doyle called me when he was diagnosed. He told me he was going to reach out to a journalist. He asked me to trust him. I told him I wasn't sure I could trust anyone at this point. She paused. He told me your name. I said, he was a complicated man. She said, he was a man who made a terrible decision and spent 22 years knowing it was terrible and not knowing how to undo it. She drank her coffee. He saved my father's life. He also ensured that 2 men, a judge, a senator, went free who should have been prosecuted. He also ensured that a man named Joseph Falcone was used as a prop without his consent or his family's knowledge. Those 3 things are all true simultaneously. I've been living with that arithmetic for a long time. I said, tell me about the other person. The one who found your father. She set down her coffee cup. Very carefully, she said, his name is Anthony Caruso. He is my father's son by another woman. He is 35 years old. He grew up not knowing the truth, and 3 years ago someone told him. She stopped. Do you know who told him? I thought of the senior DOJ official. I thought of the architecture of a secret that has been held for 20 years, and all the places along that architecture where leverage could be applied. I thought of what a man in a powerful position might do if the man who had kept his secret was dying. If the arrangement was becoming unstable. If a preemptive strike, finding the witness before anyone else could use him, controlling what happened to him, became strategically necessary. I said, I think I'm beginning to. Angela Caruso looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, he reached out to my brother, half-brother, 6 months ago. He came here. He told my father he wasn't here to cause harm. He said he just wanted to meet him, to understand. But he's been asking questions that go beyond that. He has a fake law license. He has outfit connections that he shouldn't have if his story about not knowing who his father was is entirely true. She paused. I think my father is being used. Again, by different people, for different reasons. But the principle is the same. He has information that powerful people want controlled. And now there's a young man in his life who appeared from nowhere and claims to be his son. I said, do you believe the son is genuinely his son? She said, the DNA doesn't lie. I had it checked. He is. She looked at her hands. That's the cruelest part. He's real. He's genuinely my brother, and I still can't trust him. I met Anthony Caruso on a Thursday morning in early February, 2020. Angela arranged it, against her father's initial refusal, by telling him, as she told me afterward, simply that Doyle was dead and that it was over and that the choice was no longer whether the story came out but only whether he had any say in how it did. He met me in his kitchen. It was a small, clean kitchen, pale yellow walls, a window with a view of the desert. He was wearing jeans and a flannel shirt and he poured us both coffee without asking whether I wanted any, which struck me as a very Chicago thing to do. A gesture from a world he'd been excised from for 2 decades that persisted in his muscle memory. He sat across from me. He was 68 years old. He looked like a man who had gotten up early every morning for 22 years and gone to bed early every night and eaten regular meals and taken walks in the desert and done all the right reasonable things that you do when the alternative is being consumed by what you are. He looked, honestly, like a man at peace with a past he did not intend to discuss. He said, ask me what you came to ask me. I said, I want to know what happened to the documents. The originals. He looked at me for a long time. He said, they're still here. I said, here in Tucson? He said, here in this house. He looked at his coffee. I've moved them twice. First time was when the real estate transaction went wrong, when the court filing exposed the LLC. Someone was looking, I could tell. So I moved the documents. Kept them closer. He looked up at me. And the second time was 6 months ago, when my son showed up. I said, does your son know they exist? He said, he knows about them. He grew up not knowing, and then someone told him. That's why he came. Not to meet me, though that's real too, I believe that. But also because someone told him the documents existed, and that they were with me, and that they were worth an enormous amount to the right people. I said, who told him? He said a name. I am not writing that name in this account. I am not writing it because the legal proceedings that have been initiated as a result of my reporting, and that were still ongoing as of the time I finished this text, make it inappropriate for me to publish it here. I will say only that the name was the name I expected. The name of the senior Department of Justice official. The man who had, 22 years earlier, argued for suppression. Who had watched Raymond Doyle die. Who had, apparently, decided that with Doyle gone, the remaining risk was the documents themselves and the man who held them, and that the most elegant solution was to use Caruso's own son, a young man who had every reason to feel rage and betrayal and hunger for a father he'd never known, as an instrument. Caruso said, "I know what you're thinking. You're thinking he's a weapon pointed at me." I said, "Isn't he?" Caruso said, "He's also my son." He was quiet for a moment. "I've spent 22 years being somebody's instrument. First the outfit, then the FBI. Now possibly, I don't know, someone else. I'm 68 years old. My daughter is here with me. My son is here, and I don't know if he's here to hurt me or to know me, and I'm not sure he knows either. And you're here." He looked at me directly. "What are you going to do with what I'm giving you?" I said, "Publish it." He said, "All of it? My name? My location?" I said, "Not your location. Not yet, but your name, your survival, the corruption, yes. That's what Doyle wanted. That's what he died trying to make happen." He was quiet for a long time. Then he reached into the kitchen drawer and produced a folded piece of paper and slid it across the table. It was handwritten, a list of names, dates, and storage location addresses. His handwriting was small and careful. He said, "The documents are in a storage facility north of here. The access codes are on that paper. You take them. I don't want them anymore. I've been living with them for 22 years and they haven't kept me safe. They've just kept me scared." He looked at his hands. "You publish what you can prove and you leave me alone and you let me have whatever time I have left." I said, "And your son?" He said, "That's between me and him." I drove back to Baltimore. It was a 3-day drive because I was in no hurry and I needed to think. I stopped in New Mexico the first night and Texas the second, and I ate at diners and listened to the radio and thought about what I had, the documents, Doyle's records, the corroborating testimony of a dying FBI agent now deceased, the corroborating testimony of a retired journalist, the financial trail assembled by Marcus Webb, my own direct confirmed identification of Anthony Caruso in Tucson, and an extraordinary conversation recorded with his consent in his kitchen on a Thursday morning in February. I thought about what publication would mean. I thought about it the way I always think about these things, which is to try to be honest about every category of consequence rather than just the categories that support the conclusion I've already reached. The documentation Caruso had provided in 1997 was now 23 years old. Senator Brennan had died of a heart attack in 2011. The deputy U.S. attorney had retired and died in 2014. The judge had retired and, to my knowledge, was still alive and elderly and in a memory care facility in a suburb of Chicago. These 3 individuals, 2 dead, 1 incapacitated, could not be prosecuted. The exposure of their crimes would cause harm to their surviving families without achieving any legal accountability. It would, however, expose the systematic nature of the corruption and the fact that the suppression of this information had allowed them to die without consequence. It would contribute to the historical record. Whether that justification was sufficient to expose living family members to public grief and scrutiny was a question I was genuinely uncertain about. The living official, the DOJ man, could be investigated, charged, potentially prosecuted for his role in the cover-up and for his apparent recent involvement in the maneuvering around Caruso's son. This was the clearest case. His position made it also the highest stakes case. Publishing his name would trigger retaliation of a kind I was realistic about. And there was Anthony Caruso himself. He was alive. He had participated in a staged death involving an unconsenting corpse. He had laundered money for organized crime for 20 years. He had accepted an illegal federal arrangement and lived under it for 22 more years. He was also, unambiguously, the source of information that had exposed genuine and serious corruption that had been suppressed specifically to protect powerful people. What his legal exposure would be if he was publicly identified was something I had consulted a lawyer about carefully and obliquely, and the answer was complicated. Very complicated. Statute of limitations issues, the nature of the suppression, the fact that his cooperation had been real even if the mechanism of it had been illegal. There was no clean outcome. I called Howard Reese from a truck stop in eastern Texas. I told him everything, all of it, the whole story, from the voicemail to the kitchen in Tucson. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. He said, "How solid is the documentation?" I said, "Extremely." He said, "How solid is the source corroboration?" I said, "2 independent sources for the core facts, plus my own direct confirmation of Caruso's identity and location." He said, "And the DOJ official?" I said, "Solid. Doyle's records, the son's testimony when I eventually got part of it, and the financial trail Marcus built." He said, "Elena?" I said, "I know." He said, "This is the biggest story you've ever had. Possibly the biggest story this organization has ever had." I said, "I know." He said, "I need you to come home and sit down with me and our lawyers, and we need to go through every page of what you have before we make any decisions." I said, "That's what I'm doing." He said, "And Elena?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Are you being careful?" I looked out the windshield at the flat brown Texas landscape. I thought about the lock on my apartment door. I thought about the postcard in Patricia Okafor's evidence sleeve. I thought about a man eating avocados in a Safeway and not knowing I was watching him. And then knowing. I said, "I'm trying." The Harrington Institute published the first part of my investigation in April of 2020. The timing was terrible. The country was shutting down, the pandemic was consuming every headline, and a story about organized crime and federal corruption from the 1990s was not what anyone was primed to pay attention to. We published anyway, because the calculus of, is this the right time to publish, is one that will always resolve in favor of indefinite postponement if you let it. The story generated significant attention within the legal and law enforcement communities, though less public noise than it would have at any other moment in history. The Department of Justice opened an internal review of the suppression decision. The review was conducted by a division headed by a person who had no connection to the events in question, which was something I had specifically advocated for with DOJ sources before publication. That review is, as of when I finished writing this account, still ongoing. I have been told by people I trust that it is being conducted seriously. I have also been told by people I trust that I should not hold my breath. The living federal judge, the one in the memory care facility, died 6 weeks after publication. His family issued a statement through an attorney disputing the characterizations in my story. They did not take legal action. The DOJ official has not been charged. He has retired. His retirement was announced as voluntary and unrelated to my reporting. I leave it to you to evaluate that characterization. Raymond Doyle is dead. Joseph Falcone is still buried under someone else's name in a grave that his sister has never visited because, as far as she knows, her brother died of an overdose in a hotel room and his remains were cremated and dispersed, which is what the falsified records show. I spent 2 months trying to determine whether she was still alive and where she was, and I found her, and I wrote her a letter, and I have not yet received a response. I don't know if I ever will. I don't know if what I would tell her if she responds would be a gift or a wound, and I hold that uncertainty every day. Anthony Caruso is no longer in Tucson. He left Desert Sunrise Estates approximately 2 weeks before publication, with Angela and with his son, whose role in the events of the preceding year was something I have still not fully resolved. Daniel Ferraro, Anthony Jr., gave me one conversation before they left, in which he told me that he had been approached by the DOJ official. That he had been told a version of his father's story that was designed to produce a specific reaction, and that he had come to Tucson in a state of genuine confusion about his own intentions. He said, "I thought I wanted the documents to give to someone who would use them. Then I met him. Then I didn't know what I wanted." He said, He's my father. That's real. I don't know what to do with everything else being real at the same time. I don't know where Anthony Caruso is now. Angela made sure of that. She gave me enough to publish and she kept the rest, and I think that was the correct decision. And I think she is a profoundly principled woman who has spent her entire adult life managing an impossible inheritance, and I think she deserved a better story than the one she was born into. I will tell you the thing that keeps me awake. The thing that didn't make it into the published version because my lawyers and Howard and I, together, decided it crossed a line I was not yet ready to cross. For reasons I can explain but not entirely justify. In Doyle's records, among the 847 pages I photographed in that storage unit in Addison, Illinois, there was a document that was not related to the Clean Ledger investigation. It was a memorandum, dated January 1999, from an address within the FBI's field office structure that I could not immediately identify. It was addressed to no one by name, just a number, an internal routing code. It described, in terse bureaucratic language, a surveillance protocol that had been established for a list of individuals. The list had 12 names on it. 7 of those names I recognized as journalists, investigative journalists, all of them, who had at various points in the late 90s and early 2000s been covering stories related to federal law enforcement or organized crime. One of the names on the list was Patricia Okafor. She had been surveilled for at least 2 years, beginning in 1998. Another name on the list was a journalist I knew personally. I will not say who. And there was something else in that memorandum. A note, handwritten in the margin, in ink that was slightly different from the body text. 4 words. These 4 words I have also not published. I have shown them to 2 other people, Howard Reese and a constitutional lawyer who advises our organization. Both of them have told me to wait, to gather more, to be certain of what I'm claiming before I claim it. They are right. I know they are right. But I also know what those 4 words say. And I know that if they mean what I think they mean. The story I have published so far is not the end of something. It is the beginning of a different, deeper story, one that reaches past Anthony Caruso and Raymond Doyle and even the DOJ official, into something structural, something institutional, something that was built and maintained and protected across administrations and decades for reasons that I can partially see and cannot yet fully name. I check my locks 3 times every night. I keep copies of everything in multiple locations. I have a go bag by my door, the kind they tell you to prepare for emergencies, except that mine is prepared specifically for a different kind of emergency than flooding or power outages. I am still working. I don't know how this ends. Some stories don't end when you publish them. I told you that at the beginning, and now you know what I meant. The question I go to sleep with every night is not whether to keep going. It is whether anything I find and publish will land somewhere it can actually change something, or whether the systems that protected these secrets for 22 years are flexible enough, adaptive enough, to absorb the truth and continue. I don't have an answer. I have 847 pages of photographs and an encrypted drive at my sister's house and a 4-word margin note that I can't stop thinking about. And somewhere, in a city I don't know, under a name I don't have, a 68-year-old man is making coffee in a kitchen I've never seen. Looking out a window at whatever is outside it, carrying everything he knows. And I am here, still working, still watching,